The town was the kind of place where nights usually passed without notice. After sunset, shop lights went dark one by one, streets emptied, and only the sound of distant dogs or passing trucks broke the silence. People here believed trouble belonged to bigger cities, not to a town where everyone knew each other's faces, routines, and mistakes. That belief shattered on a cold evening when the roar of engines rolled in like thunder. At first, it sounded like one bike. Then two, then many. The noise grew louder, sharper, until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. People looked out of windows. A few stepped onto porches. Everyone felt it at the same time. Something was wrong. A group of bikers rode into town in a loose formation, leather jackets dark against the streetlights. Their bikes slowed near a small roadside stop where a fuel pump, convenience store, and a worn bench stood under a flickering light. The place was still open, run by a tired clerk who had already planned to close early. The bikers parked without care, engines still growling. Laughter echoed. It was loud, careless, and meant to be heard. The clerk froze behind the counter, hands shaking as he pretended to organize items that were already straight. A couple from the neighborhood had been filling their car. They paused, unsure whether to leave or stay. One biker stared at them until the man lowered his head and guided his partner. Back into the car without a word, fear spread fast. Quiet but heavy. Across the street, standing near a bus stop, was a man most people had seen before but never really noticed. He was thin, older than he looked at first glance, wearing a faded jacket that had lost its shape years ago. His shoes were worn, the soles uneven, as if he walked more than he rested. He had been waiting for the bus, or maybe just sitting there for warmth. No one knew. No one ever asked him much of anything. When the bikers arrived, he stood up slowly. At first, people thought he was leaving. That would have made sense. Anyone else would have walked away, slipped into the dark, stayed invisible. But instead, he crossed the street, step by step, calm and steady. He walked toward them. One of the bikers noticed him and laughed. Another shook his head as if watching something foolish unfold. The engines quieted, but the tension did not. "What are you looking at?" One of them called out. The man stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He just stood there, straight-backed despite the cold. "Despite the danger, you shouldn't be here," he said simply. The laughter stopped. For a moment, even the wind seemed to pause. The biker who had spoken first stepped closer. He was taller, broader, confident in the way people are when they believe nothing can touch them. "And who's going to stop us?" he asked. The man swallowed, but he didn't step back. "I am," he replied. People watching from windows felt their hearts jump. Someone whispered a prayer. Another reached for a phone. Already dialing emergency services with trembling fingers, the bikers surrounded him in a loose circle, not touching him yet, but close enough that he could feel their presence from every side. "You lost, old man," one of them sneered. "No," the man said. "I know exactly where I am." He looked past them, not at their faces, but at their jackets, their bikes, their symbols. His eyes held recognition, not curiosity, not fear, but something heavier. That was when people realized this. It wasn't random. This wasn't bravery for show. This was personal. The clerk finally found his voice, shouted that the police were on the way. One biker kicked the bench over. Another spat on the ground. The leader raised a hand, signaling restraint. But his eyes stayed locked on the man. "You're making a mistake," the biker said quietly. The man nodded. "I know." That answer unsettled them more than shouting would have. Sirens grew in the distance, faint at first, then clearer. The man exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for years. When the police arrived, lights flashing blue and red across the street, the scene froze. Officers jumped out, hands ready, voices firm but controlled. Everyone expected the man to point, to accuse, to step away. Instead, he turned toward the officers and raised his hands. "Please," he said, "take me with you." The officers stared at him, confused. "They were causing trouble," one officer said. "You're not under arrest." The man shook his head. His voice broke just slightly. No, please. I need to go to jail tonight. The bikers burst into laughter again, louder this time. See? He's not right in the head, someone said, but the man wasn't joking. His hands trembled as he held them up higher, as if afraid the moment might slip away. If you let them leave, he said to the officers, something terrible will happen. The officers exchanged looks. They separated the group, questioning the bikers, checking IDs, searching for clear reasons to detain them. The bikers protested, angry and loud. But the earlier disturbance gave the police enough cause to hold them for the night. Still, the man kept repeating his request. Please, he said again and again, lock me up. Eventually, for his own safety and due to his involvement, they agreed to take him in as well. As he sat in the back of the patrol car, things resting quietly on his knees, relief washed over his face. Not relief from fear, but relief from waiting. People watching from the street felt unsettled. None of it made sense. Why would someone step into danger? Why would anyone beg for a cell? The car door closed. The engine started, and as the vehicles drove away, the town returned to silence, but it was no longer peaceful, because somewhere behind those flashing lights was a man who had just done something no one understood yet, and whatever his reason was, it was strong enough to face a biker gang, and strong enough to choose a jail cell over freedom. That night, while the town slept, his story was only beginning. The ride to the station felt longer than it really was. The man sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, staring at the metal screen in front of him. The flashing lights painted his face in blue and red, over and over, like waves. Each time the colors passed, his eyes softened, as if he was counting something only he could see. The officer driving glanced at him through the mirror more than once. Most people cried, argued, or begged not to be taken in. This man did none of that. He looked calm in a way that made the silence uncomfortable. When they arrived, the station was almost empty. Night shifts were usually slow in a town like this. The doors buzzed open, and the man stepped out on his own, careful, respectful, as if he didn't want to cause any trouble. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and paper. A clock ticked loudly on the wall. One officer asked him to sit while they finished paperwork on the bikers, who were brought in louder and angrier, filling the room with complaints and insults. The man kept his head down. Still, he listened. He heard their voices and flinched, just slightly. It was enough to notice if someone was watching closely when it was finally his turn. An officer asked for his name and details. He answered softly. Some questions he answered clearly. Others he avoided, not by refusing, but by drifting away. As if the words were too heavy to hold. You understand you don't have to stay here, the officer said. You could go home once things calm down. The man looked up then. His eyes were tired but sharp. No, he said. I need to stay. For what reason? He hesitated. His hands folded together, then tightened. If I leave, he said, they will too. And then it will be too late. The officer leaned back. Too late for what? The man shook his head slowly. I can't explain it yet. That answer didn't sit well, but there was something in his voice that stopped further pushing. It wasn't defiance. It was fear mixed with purpose. They processed him like anyone else. Shoes removed, jacket taken, pockets emptied. He winced when he raised his arms, and the officer noticed bruises along his ribs, old and new, layered together. No one asked how he got them. He was led to a holding cell with two other men sleeping on narrow benches. The door closed with a heavy sound that echoed longer than expected. Instead of panicking, the man exhaled. He sat down slowly, leaning his back against the cold wall. His shoulders dropped, like he had finally put something down. Hours passed. From down the hall came raised voices as officers dealt with the bikers. Arguments, demands, threats of lawyers and calls. The man listened carefully, tracking each sound, each shift in tone. At one point, he stood and gripped the bars. Please, he called out to a passing guard. Don't let them leave tonight. The guard paused, studying him. Why are you so worried about them? The man swallowed. Because they don't forget. The guard frowned but said nothing and walked on. Later, when the noise quieted, the man finally closed his eyes. But sleep did not come. His mind moved backward instead. He remembered another night, years ago, when engines sounded the same. Back then, he had been younger, stronger, with a life that felt solid. He remembered standing in a doorway, watching lights disappear down a road. Believing things would return to normal by morning, they never did. A cough from one of the other men in the cell pulled him back to the present. The man rubbed his face with both hands. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. Near dawn, an officer came to check on him. The man stood immediately, alert. "Are they still here?" he asked. "Yes," the officer said. "For now." The man nodded, relief flooding his face again. He sank back down, whispering something under his breath that sounded like thanks. As morning crept in, the station grew busier. Day officers arrived. Phones rang. Paperwork stacked up. The bikers were moved to another area, quieter now, but still dangerous in the way coiled wire is dangerous. A senior officer reviewed the night's events and noticed the man's file. "Who's this?" he asked. "No real charges," another officer said. He insisted on staying. The senior officer studied the notes, then walked over to the holding cell. "You stopped a group of armed men," he said. "That's not something people do for no reason." The man met his gaze. For the first time, his composure cracked. "I didn't stop them," he said quietly. "I slowed them down." The officer waited. "There are people who don't get second chances," the man continued. "I couldn't let tonight be one of those nights." The officer noticed something then, the man's jacket folded neatly on a chair nearby. It looked worn, but cared for. Something bulged slightly in the inside pocket. "Is there anything in there we should know about?" the officer asked. The man looked toward the jacket. His throat tightened. "Yes," he said, "but please, handle it gently." The officer opened the pocket carefully and found a folded piece of paper and a small old photograph. The photo was creased, the edges soft from years of being held. It showed a younger version of the man, smiling beside someone much smaller. Their faces close, joyful and unguarded. The officer's expression changed. "Who is this?" The man's voice shook. "The reason I'm here." The officer didn't push further. He placed the items back and closed the pocket. Whatever this man was hiding, it wasn't criminal, it was painful. As the sun rose fully, the town outside woke up. Unaware of the quiet struggle unfolding inside the station, the man remained behind bars, watching light creep across the floor. He did not ask to leave. He waited because somewhere, between those walls and the locked doors, time was finally standing still, and for the first time in years. That was exactly what he needed by the time the sun was fully up. The station had become a quiet hive of activity. Phones rang, doors opened and closed, and officers moved between desks, carrying stacks of paper. The bikers were still detained, now separated into different rooms, their voices echoing faintly down the hall. The man remained in the holding cell, sitting on the edge of a narrow bench, staring at the wall as if it held answers. He had not slept. His mind replayed the night over and over, the roar of the engines, the way the bikers had looked at him, their confusion, the way the officers had reacted to his insistence. Every detail was etched into him. It was all important, every small movement, every sound, every breath. A guard approached with a clipboard in hand. He glanced at the man, trying to read him. "Why are you so sure they'll do something?" the guard asked. He didn't expect an answer, but he wanted one anyway. The man's voice was low but steady. "Because I know them." The guard raised an eyebrow. "Know them?" "Yes," the man said, his eyes dropping to his hands. "I've known them for a long time. Not like friends. Not like neighbors. But in ways you wouldn't understand." The guard didn't press further. Some things people aren't ready to hear, and this was one of them. Later, as paperwork and calls settled into a rhythm, another officer noticed the folded photograph and letter still tucked into the man's jacket pocket. Curiosity overrode caution, and he carefully pulled them out, opening the letter gently. It was written in neat, careful handwriting. Words faded but still clear. The words told a story of loss, of years spent trying to protect someone, of nights filled with fear and worry. It spoke of a family member who had disappeared, of unanswered questions, of people who had been involved in ways that only time could reveal. Every line carried weight, every word seemed to pull at the heart. The officer looked up at the man, who was quietly watching from across the cell. This is why you were so determined?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "I had to make sure tonight didn't erase the chance for answers. If they left, if they got away, it could be another night lost, another piece of the puzzle gone forever." The officer didn't respond. There were some things that words couldn't explain, some fears that only a person could carry alone. And in that moment, he realized the man wasn't brave for recognition or attention. He was brave because he carried something unbearable, something that no one else could see, and he was willing to risk himself to protect it. Hours passed. The man remained mostly quiet, only speaking when necessary, giving small answers or nods. The bikers were questioned by investigators. Slowly, details began to emerge. Names, movements, stories of past incidents, but nothing that connected directly to the man's reasons for staying. At least, not yet. During a rare moment of silence, he allowed himself to breathe a little more freely. He opened his jacket carefully and pulled out the photograph again, holding it gently. The image showed a young face beside his own, smiling, happy, unaware of the shadows creeping in the background of life. He traced the edges with a finger, remembering the warmth, the laughter, the ordinary moments that had been stolen by fate. A newer officer walked by and noticed him. "Who is that?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. "The reason I'm here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, sensing that pushing for more would only break something delicate as the day progressed. An investigator decided to search the man's jacket more thoroughly. He discovered a small notebook tucked inside a hidden pocket. The pages were filled with observations, timelines, and even small sketches of locations and people. It was clear that the man had been tracking the bikers for years, quietly, without anyone knowing. Every small movement, every trip, every pattern had been recorded meticulously. The realization hit the investigators. This wasn't a random act of courage. It was a calculated move, designed to protect, to prevent, and to uncover the truth. The man noticed their discovery but did not react. He had expected it. Every officer who had looked through the notebook could see it immediately. There was intelligence here, but also pain, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. In a quieter moment, the senior officer approached the cell. "Why did you come forward tonight, knowing what could happen?" he asked. The man looked up, eyes glistening with emotion. "Because I had no choice. They were going to leave. And if they left, no one would have found what needed to be found. I've spent years trying to keep hope alive, and tonight was the last chance." The officer studied him carefully. "Hope for what?" The man closed his eyes, his voice trembling just slightly. "For the truth. For the person I lost. For the answers that have haunted me for so long." As the day turned into evening, the officers began piecing together information from the bikers' past actions. They found connections to a missing person case that had been cold for years. There were subtle clues, items lost and forgotten. Hints of a story that had gone unnoticed by everyone except the man who had stood in front of the gang the night before. He remained calm, watching quietly, answering only when necessary. But inside, his heart raced. Every piece of information confirmed what he had feared. What he had known deep down, the bikers held the key to something painful, something unresolved, something that had shaped the course of his life. Later, in a private room, the man finally allowed himself to speak freely to one officer. He recounted fragments of his past, never naming anyone, never giving details that could endanger others. He spoke of nights spent searching, of quiet observations, of the constant fear that something worse could happen if he failed. The officer listened in silence. Realizing that the man had carried the weight of this secret for far too long, it wasn't anger that motivated him. It wasn't revenge. It was love, concern, and the desperate need for closure. As night fell again, the station quieted down. The bikers were moved to separate cells in the back of the building. The man remained in the holding area, not out of fear, but because he knew that his work was not yet done. He had slowed them, delayed them, bought time for the truth to begin to surface. He sat alone, holding the photograph and notebook in his lap. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear, a small spark of hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. Somewhere down the hall, the investigators were starting to understand the depth of his sacrifice. They saw it not as bravery in the traditional sense, but as courage driven by something much more human, the need to protect, to uncover, to remember, and in that quiet, cold room, the man realized that for the first time, he was not alone in his fight. The truth was beginning to wake, and with it, the chance to finally find the answers that had haunted him for so long. He had stopped the bikers not for glory, not for recognition, but to ensure that what had been lost could finally be found. As the investigation continued into the early hours of the next day, the truth that had been hidden for years began to surface. The officers went through old case files, comparing details from the night of the man's encounter with the bikers, two incidents recorded long ago. Slowly, connections started to emerge. Names, locations, and timelines aligned in a way that no one had noticed before. The man watched silently from the holding area. His hands rested on the photograph and notebook he had kept close. He did not speak unless directly asked. The officers began to realize that he was more than just a witness. He had been quietly carrying the puzzle pieces for years, holding on to them until the right moment. One officer came over with a folder filled with old reports. "These bikers," he said, "they've been linked to missing person cases before. We never had enough evidence, but now." "It looks like you were right." The man nodded slowly. "I knew they were connected. I just didn't know how far it went until tonight." The officers began questioning the bikers separately, carefully extracting information. Each biker was defensive, angry, and yet nervous. Some tried to lie, some tried to shift blame. But the details they provided began to match the timelines in the man's notebook. The events he had recorded years ago started to make sense, and the missing pieces of the story began to fit together. During one quiet moment, the man was asked to recount what he had seen that night and why he had intervened. He told the officers about the bikers' patterns, their previous stops, and the behavior he had observed over the years. His voice was calm, but there was a raw honesty that made the room silent. Every word he spoke carried weight because it came from someone who had lived with the fear and responsibility for too long. As the day wore on, a surprising discovery was made. One of the bikers had inadvertently left behind a personal item, a small piece of jewelry, at a location the man had marked in his notebook. Years ago, it matched a description of an item that had belonged to his missing family member. The officers were stunned. The man's predictions had not been random guesses. They were based on careful observation, memory, and the desperate need to find answers. He sat quietly as the officers examined the evidence. He did not celebrate. He did not speak triumphantly. Relief and exhaustion washed over him, but it was quiet, internal, a small flame in the darkness he had carried for so long. This was not about revenge or recognition. It was about finally uncovering the truth. By the evening, the senior officer gathered all the evidence together. The bikers were confronted with a growing pile of proof, and their demeanor changed. Some broke under pressure, admitting details they had hidden for years. Others remained defiant. But the consistency of the man's records and the newly discovered evidence left little room for escape. The man watched the confessions unfold. He felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, grief, and a lingering sadness. Years of waiting, worrying, and fearing the worst were finally paying off, but the journey was far from over. He had found answers, but they brought more pain than he had expected. The truth, after all, is rarely gentle. One of the officers approached him, a look of respect in his eyes. "You risked your life tonight for this," he said. "Not many people would have done what you did." The man shook his head. "I didn't do it for me. I did it for them. For the ones who couldn't fight back, who couldn't speak up. I had to make sure someone could find the truth, even if it cost me everything. Later, the man was asked to identify items connected to the missing person case. As he handled each object, memories flooded back, moments of joy, moments of fear, and the constant hope that someone would remember. He touched a small piece of clothing, recognizing it instantly. It had been missing for years, but he had remembered every detail. The officers worked tirelessly through the night. They pieced together a timeline that finally made sense. The bikers' movements were linked to locations connected to the missing person case. Evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed for years was now being examined with fresh eyes. The man's presence had forced the investigation to proceed, to dig deeper and to uncover what had been hidden. As dawn approached, the officers gathered in a room with the man to discuss their findings. The weight of the revelations was heavy. They had discovered more than they had anticipated, including details that explained why the bikers had acted the way they did that night. They'd also uncovered information that could bring justice for the family. The man had been trying to protect. The man listened quietly, absorbing every word. He felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief, because the truth was finally coming to light. Sorrow, because the journey had been so long and painful. The realization that justice was possible brought him a quiet comfort, but it could not erase the years of fear and uncertainty he had endured. Officers began to take statements, collecting every detail the man could remember. They cross-referenced his notebook with the biker's confessions, creating a clear picture of events that had remained a mystery for years. The man's meticulous records had been invaluable, and the officers recognized that without his intervention, the truth might never have been found. As the day progressed, the investigation reached a critical point. Evidence linked the bikers to multiple locations connected to the missing person case. Items recovered matched descriptions from old reports. The man's predictions had been accurate, his observations precise. The investigation, once stagnant, was now moving forward with clarity and purpose. The man felt a sense of closure beginning to form, though it was fragile. He had stepped in to stop the bikers, not for recognition, not for glory, but to protect the memory of someone he had loved and lost. That purpose had guided him through years of uncertainty, and now, finally, it was bearing fruit. In a quiet moment, he looked at the photograph he had carried for so long. The smiling faces reminded him of why he had acted, why he had chosen to put himself in danger, why he had begged for jail. It was not about punishment or consequence. It was about ensuring that truth, no matter how painful, could finally be known. By the end of the day, the officers had gathered enough evidence to take decisive action. The bikers were formally charged with offenses connected to the missing person case. The man who had risked everything remained in the holding area. His mission accomplished, but his journey still personal and emotional as he finally allowed himself to rest. He understood the depth of his actions. He had faced fear, confronted danger, and endured uncertainty to protect someone who could not protect themselves. The investigation was no longer just a legal process. It was the culmination of years of quiet vigilance, careful observation, and unwavering dedication. The man knew that life would not instantly return to normal. The memories, the pain, and the longing would remain. But for the first time in many years, he felt that the truth was finally within reach. He had stopped the bikers, bought time, created the opportunity for justice to prevail, and as he closed his eyes that night, he allowed himself a small sense of peace. The truth had begun to surface, and with it, the possibility of healing, understanding, and finally finding closure for the loss he had carried for so long. The morning sun broke through the station windows, painting the room in soft light. The man sat quietly, the photograph and notebook in his lap, feeling the weight of the night settle into something tangible yet lighter than before. The bikers had been formally charged. Evidence had been cataloged. Witness statements had been taken. The investigation that had been dormant for years was now alive, active, moving toward closure. The officers gathered in a small room to review the final details. Every piece of evidence the man had provided, every observation he had recorded over years, was now a cornerstone of the case. They looked at him with a mix of respect, curiosity, and quiet amazement. "You did more than most would ever imagine," said one of the senior investigators. "You risked yourself to make sure the truth came out." The man nodded slowly. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it needed to be done. There was no other choice." One officer handed him a folder with photographs and records that had been uncovered during the investigation. He opened it carefully, turning each page with a delicate touch. These were not just pieces of evidence. They were answers to questions that had haunted him for years. Names he had feared to speak aloud now appeared in official documents. Places he had visited, traced, and recorded were now marked on maps with the weight of proof. It was real. It had been real all along. As the day progressed, the bikers were taken for further questioning, and more confessions began to emerge. Some were hesitant, some were angry, but the consistency of the man's records and the mounting evidence left little room for denial. Every answer they gave reinforced the painstaking accuracy of his observations. He had not only predicted their actions, he had prepared for them, waited for the right moment, and used every resource at his disposal to make sure the truth could not be hidden. Throughout it all, he remained calm, almost serene. The tension that had gripped him when he first stepped in front of the gang had given way to a focused patience. He had done what he had needed to do, and now he could watch as the story unfolded without risking more than he already had. Later, he was asked to assist in identifying specific items connected to the missing person case. He carefully pointed out objects he recognized, small personal items that had been lost years ago. A scarf, a small piece of jewelry, a worn notebook. Each one brought back memories he had tried to keep buried. Memories of laughter, warmth, and the quiet comfort of ordinary moments that had been stolen away. Handling each object, he felt the past converge with the present. Pain mingled with relief. Fear mingled with hope. He realized that the actions he had taken standing in front of the bikers, insisting on being detained, recording years of observations, had led to this moment. He had bought time, delayed danger, and created the chance for justice and closure. The investigation team worked late into the evening, cataloging evidence, comparing statements, and building the case that would bring resolution to a long-standing mystery. The man remained in the holding area, quietly observing, occasionally answering questions, and providing insights only he could offer. His knowledge, patience, and unwavering dedication had transformed what had been a cold case into a story moving toward justice by nightfall. The final pieces began to fall into place. The officers had enough evidence to ensure that the bikers could no longer avoid accountability. They were to be charged not just for the recent incident, but for their connections to past crimes. It was a victory not measured in accolades, but in truth the truth that had been denied for too long. The man finally allowed himself to breathe fully. Years of fear, worry, and silent vigilance were beginning to give way to a cautious relief. The truth was out, the evidence documented, and the chance for justice real. But even as he felt this relief, he knew that some scars would remain. Memories of lost years, of uncertainty, and of the constant vigilance would not simply disappear. They were part of the story, part of the journey that had brought him here. Later, one of the officers approached him with a small envelope. Inside was a letter from a family member who had been searching, following leads, hoping against hope that answers would emerge. The letter spoke of gratitude, of recognition for the courage and determination that had led to these revelations. The man read it quietly, a small tear sliding down his cheek. For the first time in years, he felt seen, acknowledged, and understood. He closed his eyes and held the photograph close. The smiling faces reminded him of why he had acted, why he had stood in front of the bikers, why he had begged for jail. It had not been for punishment or recognition, but to protect, to uncover, and to honor memories that could not be forgotten. As he prepared to leave the station, officers thanked him again. They understood what he had risked, what he had endured, and what he had achieved. They saw a man who had faced fear without flinching, who had carried the weight of unanswered questions for years, and who had acted with courage, patience, and selflessness. Stepping outside, he felt the air on his face, the light of the morning warming his skin. The town was waking up, unaware of the battles fought and the truths uncovered within the walls of the station. He walked slowly, letting the world settle around him, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment and peace. Though the journey had been long and painful, he had ensured that justice could move forward. The bikers had been held accountable, evidence preserved, and the story, once lost in fear and uncertainty, was now beginning to find its rightful place in the light as he disappeared into the streets. Carrying the quiet weight of all that had happened, he understood that his actions had changed more than just the course of the investigation. They had changed him. He had faced danger, fear, and uncertainty, not for himself, but for others, and in doing so, he had found a measure of closure that had eluded him for years. And though the scars of the past would remain, so too did the knowledge that sometimes courage is quiet, that sometimes bravery is patience, and that sometimes the truth, no matter how long hidden, can finally be uncovered, bringing peace, understanding, a chance to move forward. Days after the bikers were taken into custody and the case seemed to reach a turning point, the man found himself sitting quietly in a small room at the station. The weight of the past few nights had settled heavily on him, and yet he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. His notebook and photograph lay on the table in front of him, both items that had guided him through the storm he had faced. He thought about the nights he had spent planning, observing, and waiting. Every detail had mattered. Every observation he had recorded had contributed to the unraveling of the truth. He had acted not for himself, not for recognition, but to protect someone he could not forget, someone he had loved and lost long ago. And now, though some answers had been found, he knew the journey was not over. There were still questions, still pieces of the puzzle that needed closure. An officer entered the room quietly, holding a folder with new developments. "We've uncovered more evidence connected to the bikers," he said softly. "It seems there are other locations, other events tied to their past actions. Your observations are helping us connect the dots." The man nodded slowly. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility returning. Though the immediate danger of that night had passed, the pursuit of truth continued. He had stepped into fear once, but now he realized that the work he had started was far from complete. There were still lives touched by the bikers' actions, still answers that needed to be found, still memories that needed to be preserved. He opened his notebook. Flipping through the carefully recorded notes, sketches, and observations, he had anticipated many of these moments, predicting movements, patterns, and behaviors. He realized that his foresight had been accurate not by chance, but by years of watching, waiting, and paying attention to every detail. His life had become intertwined with the pursuit of truth, and he accepted it with quiet determination. The officer handed him a map showing locations. It's connected to the bikers' past activities. He pointed to each location carefully, explaining the connections and the evidence that had been gathered. The man listened attentively, recognizing the places instantly. Memories of following leads, making careful observations, and connecting subtle clues came flooding back. It was exhausting, but he felt the familiar sense of purpose returning. Later, as the station quieted, he was asked to provide insight into the bikers' behavior patterns. He spoke softly, describing tendencies, triggers, and historical actions. His knowledge was unparalleled, shaped by experience, fear, and a deep understanding of human nature. Officers recorded every word, recognizing that his observations could prevent further harm and bring justice to those affected by past events. As the night fell, he reflected on the journey that had led him here. He remembered the first time he had stood in front of the gang, the fear, the uncertainty, and the decision to risk himself for others. That night had been the catalyst, the moment that set everything in motion. Every choice he had made since then had been guided by the need to uncover the truth, protect the memory of those lost. He thought about the people who had unknowingly helped him along the way, the officers who had listened, the community members who had given subtle clues, and even the bikers themselves, whose actions had inadvertently revealed patterns and information he could use. It was a web of interconnected events, each one significant, each one contributing to the greater understanding. Throughout the night, he continued to review the notebook and photograph, making notes, drawing connections, and considering next steps. His focus was intense, but there was a quiet calm beneath it. He understood that truth was not a moment, but a process. Each discovery, each confirmation, its detail brought him closer to closure. The next morning, the investigation team gathered to discuss the new evidence. They were impressed by the depth of knowledge the man brought to the table. He spoke clearly, confidently, yet humbly. His input was shaping the direction of the investigation, guiding decisions, and ensuring that no detail was overlooked. The team began to see him not just as a witness, but as an essential contributor to the pursuit of justice. Hours passed in methodical work, cross-referencing statements, examining evidence, and mapping connections. The man worked alongside them quietly, pointing out subtle details that might have been missed, suggesting avenues of inquiry, and reminding everyone of the importance of patience and observation. His experience and insight were invaluable, and the team began to rely on him more than they had anticipated. During a brief pause, he looked at the photograph again. Memories of laughter, warmth, and love surfaced, intertwined with the pain of loss. The emotions were overwhelming, but he allowed himself to feel them fully, understanding that acknowledging the past was as important as uncovering the present. The photograph was not just an image. It was a connection to the person he had lost, a reminder of why he had risked everything. The day continued with meticulous work, interviews, and careful examination of evidence. New leads emerged, each one reinforcing the accuracy of the man's observations and notes. The investigation was becoming comprehensive, far-reaching, and precise. For the first time in years, he saw a path forward, a sense of hope that justice could be served, closure could be achieved. As evening approached, he reflected on the journey. He thought about the night he had faced the bikers, the fear that had gripped him, and the decision to step forward despite uncertainty. That moment had defined the course of everything that followed. His courage, patience, and foresight had created the opportunity for truth to emerge. He realized that courage was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it was quiet, hidden in observation, in patience, in the willingness to face fear without guarantee of recognition. His actions had been guided not by ego, but by the need to honor memories, protect others, and ensure that the truth could be known. Finally, as the station quieted and the night settled in, he allowed himself a brief moment of rest. The notebook and photograph remained by his side, symbols of the journey, the sacrifices, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Though the path ahead still held challenges, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The man understood that the fight for justice and truth was ongoing. There would always be new questions, new connections to make, and new details to uncover. But he also knew that his actions had set in motion a process that could not be stopped, a pursuit that would bring clarity, understanding, and, eventually, peace. As he closed his eyes for a moment, he thought of the person he had lost, of the memories they had shared, and of the life that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond control. He felt a sense of quiet determination. The journey was far from over, but the truth was beginning to shine, and with it came hope, recognition, and the possibility of healing in that quiet moment. He understood the depth of his own resilience, the strength of his courage, and the impact of a single person willing to face fear for the sake of truth, and he knew, deep in his heart, that the steps he had taken, the risks he had endured, and the vigilance he had maintained would not only bring closure for the past, but also guide the way for a better, safer future.